In 1962, four young men from Liverpool walked into a shop on Oxford Street, London, and recorded a demo tape. The man who listened to it picked up the phone and called EMI. The rest of the world knows what happened next. That shop was HMV. At its peak, HMV held 70% of every record sold in Britain. The Oxford Circus flagship stretched 7 floors high and pulled 9 million visitors through its doors every single year. On the night Oasis released Be Here Now, people queued on the pavement from midnight. Strangers standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold London air, united by nothing more than the love of music. For an entire generation, walking into HMV was not shopping. It was a ritual. By December 2018, that same brand, one that had stood for nearly a century, changed hands for less than £1 million, a company once valued at over $1.2 billion. How does a shop that helped launch the Beatles, that gave a generation its soundtrack, that stood at the center of British cultural life for 100 years, simply fall apart? The answer is more complicated and more human than anyone expected. The story of HMV does not begin with a shop. It begins with a dog, a dead man, and a painting nobody wanted. In 1887, a theater set designer named Mark Barrow died in Bristol, leaving behind very little: a modest estate, an unpaid creditors list, and a small terrier cross dog with a habit of nipping at visitors' ankles. The dog's name was Nipper. Mark's younger brother Francis, a painter living in Liverpool, took the animal in. Francis Barrow was not a particularly successful artist. He was, by several accounts, easily distracted, someone who found it difficult to finish things. But he was observant, and what he observed in Nipper gave him the one idea that would outlast everything else he ever did. The family owned a cylinder phonograph. Whenever Francis played it, Nipper would approach the brass horn, tilt his head to one side, and stare into it, puzzled, alert, entirely still. As Barrow later described it, the dog seemed to be trying to work out where the voice was coming from. Not alarmed, not indifferent, genuinely and earnestly trying to understand. Nipper died in the September 1895. 3 years later, working from an old photograph, Barrow put that memory onto canvas. He painted the dog exactly as he remembered him. Head tilted, ears raised, nose close to the horn of the gramophone. He called it his master's voice. The thought behind the title was this: Nipper was listening to a recording, and the voice on the recording might have been his original owner's. Mark's voice, reaching back from beyond death through a machine, a dog hearing a ghost. Loyalty without understanding of what it was being loyal to. It was one of the most quietly devastating ideas in the history of commercial art, and nobody wanted it. Barrow offered the painting first to the Edison Bell Company in 1899. Their representative told him plainly, "Dogs don't listen to phonographs." He tried publishers. He was turned away. He approached the Royal Academy. Nothing. The painting sat in his studio, rolled up, unseen. Then in May 1899, Barrow went to the offices of the Gramophone Company on Maiden Lane, just off the Strand in London. Not to sell the painting, but to borrow a brass horn. He wanted to repaint the original black horn with something more visually appealing. The company's manager, William Barry Owen, looked at the painting and made Barrow an offer: repaint the cylinder phonograph as a Berliner disc gramophone, their model, and he would buy it. Barrow obliged. The gramophone company paid him $100, $50 for the painting, $50 for the copyright. The image that would one day be worth more than any sum Barrow could have imagined changed hands for less than the cost of a decent suit. The gramophone company placed Nipper on their equipment, their labels, their advertising. The image spread across Britain, then across the world. By 1909, it had become the company's official His Master's Voice record label. By 1921, it was ready to become a shop. That summer, the Gramophone Company opened the first dedicated HMV store at 363 Oxford Street, London. A narrow shop front in a building that had previously sold men's clothing. The man who opened it was not a businessman. It was Sir Edward Elgar, the composer of Pomp and Circumstance, perhaps the most English musical figure alive at the time. His presence at the opening was a statement of intent. This was not simply a place to buy things. This was a place where music was taken seriously. The store was small by any later standard. A single room, wooden display cases, gramophones and sheet music and recordings arranged with the care of a library rather than the clutter of a market stall. But it contained something no other shop in the world offered at that moment: private listening booths. Customers could step into a small, curtained cubicle, place a record on a turntable, put on headphones and listen before they bought. In 1921, the idea that music could be experienced privately, at will, in a public space, was extraordinary. This was not shopping. This was an invitation. The founding philosophy of HMV, expressed in that detail more clearly than in any boardroom document, was simple. Music deserved to be heard properly, not demonstrated like a product, not sold like a commodity. Heard, understood, chosen. Barraud had captured that idea without meaning to, when he painted a dog listening, not performing, not reacting, just listening, with full attention to a voice it trusted. That dog would stand above every HMV sign for the next 100 years, ears up, head tilted, still trying to understand where the voice was coming from. To understand what HMV meant at its height, it helps to stand on Oxford Street in the early 1960s and watch what is happening around you. Britain is changing faster than at any point since the war. Young people have money for the first time, real spending money, their own money, money for records and clothes and things their parents never had. The teddy boys have given way to mods, and the mods are obsessed with music in a way that no generation before them quite was. They do not just listen to music, they collect it, debate it, define themselves by it. And there is only one place in London that takes that obsession seriously. The HMV shop at 363 Oxford Street is, at this moment, unlike anything else in Britain. Other shops sell records the way a chemist sells aspirin. A functional transaction, quickly done, quickly forgotten. HMV is different. HMV has the listening booths. You can walk in off the street, ask to hear something, step into a small private booth, put on headphones, and spend 20 minutes with an album before you decide whether to spend your wages on it. The staff know the stock not as a list of product codes, but as music they have actually heard. They have opinions. They will argue with you. And if you come back often enough, they will remember what you bought last time and tell you what arrived this week that you might like. In February 1962, a record shop manager named Brian Epstein walked into that same store carrying a reel-to-reel tape. He had been rejected by nearly every major label in London. Decca had famously turned down the band he managed, declaring that guitar groups were finished. Epstein stopped at HMV simply to have the tape transferred to a format that would be easier to play for potential label executives. The engineer in the upstairs studio, a man named Jim Foy, listened to the recordings and was struck by them. He mentioned the group to a music publisher from Ardmore and Beechwood, a subsidiary of EMI, who happened to be working in the same building. That publisher made a phone call. The phone call led to a meeting. The meeting led to an audition at Abbey Road. And the audition led to George Martin signing the four young men from Liverpool to Parlophone Records. The Beatles, in other words, became the Beatles in part because of a chance encounter in a HMV shop on Oxford Street. That story was not remarkable to the people who worked at HMV. It was simply Tuesday. The shop had always been where music happened, not just where it was sold, but where it circulated, where it was discovered, where careers crossed paths. What was remarkable was how long that quality endured. By the 1970s, HMV had doubled in size across Britain and held firm as the country's leading specialist music retailer. The culture around it had deepened. A trip to HMV was no longer just a shopping errand, it was an event, a ritual that shaped the week around it. You went on a Saturday. You went with friends, or alone if the mood required privacy. You moved along the racks slowly, pulling albums forward by their spines, reading the track listings, studying the sleeve art. The art itself mattered. Peter Gabriel's melting face on the second Genesis album. The shimmering horses of Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy. The bleak, perfect cover of Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures. A radio wave from a dying star. These were objects that carried meaning. You did not stream them. You held them. You spent time with them. The staff were the other constant. Record shop employees in this era occupied a particular cultural position, somewhere between a music journalist and a trusted friend. They were almost without exception people who cared too much about music to work anywhere else. They had heard everything. They were patient with beginners and demanding with the experience. They would dismiss your taste with a raised eyebrow and then spend 10 minutes explaining why you should give something difficult a chance. What they were doing, in effect, was education. Informal, unsanctioned, entirely genuine. What did it feel like to be young in Britain in the 1970s and find music through HMV? It felt like being let into something, like a door opening into a room you had not known existed. You went in looking for one thing and came out with three because someone behind the counter had said, "If you like that, you should hear this." And they were right. They were almost always right. Then came 1986, and everything that HMV had built over 6 decades was given a new physical expression. In October of that year, the company opened a new flagship store at 154 Oxford Street near Oxford Circus. 7 floors, 50,000 square feet, a building so vast and so entirely given over to music and entertainment that Guinness World Records recognized it as the largest music shop on the planet. The opening was attended by Bob Geldof, fresh from organizing Live Aid the previous year, and at that moment arguably the most famous humanitarian in Britain, and Michael Hutchence of INXS, one of the biggest rock stars on earth. Their presence was not incidental. It was a statement that HMV was not simply a retail outlet. It was a cultural institution. Inside, the scale was staggering. Floor after floor of vinyl, cassettes, and the newly arrived compact disc. Jazz in the basement. Classical on an upper floor, handled with the solemnity of a library. Pop and rock in between, sprawling and loud and constantly updated. There were listening stations throughout. There were staff recommendations handwritten on cards tucked into the racks. Brief, confident, occasionally eccentric, always sincere. What the Oxford Circus megastore represented, beyond its size, was a promise. It said, "Whatever you are looking for, it is here. Whatever you love, we take it seriously. Whatever you know nothing about yet, come in and we will show you." That promise meant something particular in the years before the internet, when music discovery was still a human and physical process. You could not type a name into a search bar and have 10,000 results in a second. You had to go somewhere. You had to ask. You had to trust someone. And for an entire generation of British music lovers, people who grew up in the 1970s and came of age in the 1980s, who formed their tastes in those racks, who spent Saturday afternoons in those aisles, HMV was the place they trusted above all others. The 1990s brought Britpop, and with it a new kind of devotion. Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Elastica, Suede. The music was everywhere. On the radio, in the magazines and the pubs, but it was in HMV that it became physical, real, something you could own. When Oasis released Be Here Now in August 1997, it sold over 350,000 copies on its first day, the fastest-selling album in British history at the time. Across the country, people queued from the night before outside HMV branches to be among the first. Oxford Street, Manchester, Glasgow, Leeds. In every city, in the cold early morning, strangers stood together in the dark waiting for the shutters to go up. They had not met before. They did not know each other, but they were there for the same thing, and that was enough. What binds a generation is rarely what they expect. It is not the albums they plan to love. It is the ones they discovered by accident, the ones pressed into their hands by someone who said simply, "Try this." How many of those moments began in a HMV shop, at the recommendation of a stranger behind a counter who knew more than you did and was generous enough to share it? That question, asked about any year from 1960 to 2000, has only one honest answer: almost all of them. The year after Be Here Now came out, HMV Group was valued at nearly £1 billion. The Oxford Street megastore was drawing 9 million visitors a year. The brand operated over 300 shops across Britain, Ireland, Canada, Japan, the United States, and beyond. And somewhere, In ways that no one in those crowded aisles had yet begun to think about, the world that had made all of this possible was quietly beginning to end. For most of its first 4 decades, HMV was essentially one shop, a famous shop, a respected shop, a shop that had helped launch the careers of some of the most celebrated musicians in British history, but a single location on Oxford Street, operating quietly under the ownership of the Gramophone Company and, later, EMI. That changed in 1966. In that year, EMI made a decision that would define HMV for the next 3 decades. They began expanding the retail format beyond London, rolling out new stores across the capital and preparing the chain for a national presence. By 1970, there were 15 HMV shops. By the mid-1970s, there were 35, and HMV had become the leading specialist music retailer in the United Kingdom. The timing was not accidental. The 1960s and 1970s were the golden age of the album. Record sales across Britain were growing year on year. Young people were spending more on music than any generation before them, and the high street was the place where that spending happened. HMV was positioned exactly where it needed to be. The expansion was not simply a matter of opening more doors. Each new store carried with it the weight of the original philosophy, the listening booths, the knowledgeable staff, the sense that music was being taken seriously rather than sold cheaply. This was not easy to replicate at scale. A single shop on Oxford Street could maintain its culture through the people who worked there, who had been trained by people who remembered what HMV had always stood for. 35 shops spread across Britain required something more deliberate, and for a time HMV managed it. The stores in Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Glasgow each developed their own character, shaped by local staff, local customers, local taste, while remaining recognizably, unmistakably HMV. The competition was watching. In 1972, our Price opened on the British High Street, offering a more accessible, less specialist approach to music retail. In 1976, Virgin Megastores arrived, with Richard Branson's characteristic flair for noise and scale. HMV responded by getting bigger and better, rather than cheaper and louder. It was a choice that reflected a genuine belief, perhaps in hindsight an overconfident one, that the customer who valued quality and expertise would always be willing to seek it out. HMV overtook our Price, it held its own against Virgin, and then in 1986 it made the move that announced its ambitions to the entire world. In October of that year, having been restructured as an autonomous division within Thorn EMI, HMV opened its new flagship at 154 Oxford Street. 50,000 square feet, 7 floors. Guinness World Records certified it as the largest music shop on the planet. Bob Geldof cut the ribbon. The message was clear. HMV was no longer merely a British institution. It was reaching for something larger. The international expansion followed almost immediately. In 1987, the first HMV store outside the United Kingdom opened in Mississauga, Ontario. Canada was a natural first step. Culturally close, commercially familiar, hungry for the kind of specialist music retail that did not yet exist there in the HMV form. The Canadian stores were a swift success, and confidence grew. By 1990, HMV had entered the United States, Japan, and Australia. Stores followed in Hong Kong and Singapore. The pink Nipper logo appeared on high streets from Toronto to Tokyo, from Sydney to San Francisco. For the employees who opened those early international stores, there was a genuine sense of mission. They were not just launching a shop, they were exporting a culture, the idea that music retail could be more than a transaction, that a shop could be a place of discovery, community, and genuine expertise. In Japan especially, HMV found an audience that received it with an intensity that even surprised the company's own executives. Japanese music consumers were deeply serious about physical media, about sleeve art, about the act of ownership. They understood instinctively what HMV was offering. The Japanese business grew rapidly and became one of the most profitable parts of the international operation. By the mid-1990s, HMV had over 300 shops internationally. In 1997, it opened its 100th UK location. The following year, 1998, marked the most significant corporate transformation in the company's history. EMI, recognizing that its retail arm had outgrown its role as a subsidiary, entered into a joint venture with the private equity firm Advent International to create a new entity, HMV Media Group. The new company acquired the HMV shops and the Dillon's bookshop chain, and then, in a move that would reshape HMV's future in ways that were not yet visible, it purchased the Waterstones chain of bookshops from W.H. Smith for $300 million. The logic was understandable. Music, film, books, all were forms of culture, all were sold to broadly similar customers, all belonged on a high street that was still, in 1998, the center of British retail life. The idea was to create a cultural superstore in the minds of British consumers. If you wanted music, you went to HMV. If you wanted books, you went to Waterstones. And increasingly, you might find both under the same corporate umbrella, if not the same roof. What the logic did not account for was the weight of the debt that came with the Waterstones acquisition. £300 million is a large sum to carry at any time. Carried into a decade in which the entire physical media market would begin to contract, it would become something considerably more dangerous than a calculated risk. In 2002, HMV Media floated on the London Stock Exchange as HMV Group plc. The share price reflected investor confidence. The company operated over 540 shops, including more than 340 HMV music stores and nearly 200 Waterstones bookshops. It was, on paper, a formidable empire. But empires built on physical products, sold from expensive city center locations, carrying significant debt from ambitious acquisitions, need the market to remain stable in order to function. And the market, though no one in those glossy analyst presentations quite wanted to say so plainly, was not going to remain stable for very much longer. In 1998, the year HMV Group was formed, a company called Napster was 1 year away from launching. Nobody in the boardroom had heard of it yet. By the mid-1990s, HMV was no longer simply a shop. It had become something rarer and harder to define, a civic institution of British cultural life, as embedded in the rhythm of the week as the pub, the football ground, and the Sunday newspaper. Every significant high street in Britain had one. Every significant town center was, in some quiet way, measured against the question of whether it had one. To be without an HMV was to be, culturally speaking, slightly outside the main conversation. What had made this possible was not just quality, though the quality was real. It was consistency. For 30 years of expansion, HMV had managed to be the same thing in Manchester as it was in London, in Glasgow as it was in Bristol, a place where music was taken seriously, where the staff knew what they were talking about, where you could spend an hour without buying anything and leave feeling that the time had been well spent. That is not a small achievement for a chain of any size. For a chain of over 300 shops, it is remarkable. The generational transmission had deepened by this point into something close to ritual. A father who had bought his first Beatles single at HMV in 1965 now stood at the till beside his teenage son, who was buying his first Oasis album. Neither of them would have thought to frame it in those terms. They were just going to the shops, but the continuity was real. HMV was one of the few places where different generations of British people regularly occupied the same physical space, standing beside one another at the racks, reaching for different things, occasionally stopping to glance at what the other was holding. There were few other institutions in Britain that could claim the same. The in-store events had by this point become something entirely their own, a form of live culture that existed nowhere else in quite the same way. A senior HMV figure who spent nearly 30 years with the company described what those years contained. A live performance by Madonna at the Oxford Circus flagship, Paul McCartney arriving to relaunch the same store, the Spice Girls switching on the Christmas lights, bringing the West End to a halt, over 5,000 Bros fans bringing Oxford Street to a standstill, Blur performing live on the roof of the original 363 Oxford Street shop, with a police inspector threatening to cut the power if word spread and a crowd gathered. Destiny's Child performing in store, the event escalating until the Evening Standard ran the headline, Riot in Oxford Street. These were not marketing events in the modern sense, calculated, focus grouped, managed through social media. They were happening in real time, in a physical space, with real consequences and no guarantee of control. That was precisely what made them extraordinary. HMV was the only platform in Britain that could produce them because HMV was the only place where the music industry, the artists, and the public all met on equal ground. Not at a concert, where the distance between stage and audience is everything, but in a shop, where the distance was nothing at all. Prince once signed albums for fans, writing the words "Love God 88" in every copy. His security team confiscated every camera in the building. George Harrison shopped there quietly, without announcement. Michael Jackson visited regularly. A Take That fan shrine appeared spontaneously at Oxford Circus on the day the band announced they were splitting. Flowers and handwritten notes left against the shelving by fans who had nowhere else to bring their grief. That last detail is worth holding. When people did not know where else to take something, joy or loss, or the particular feeling of music being threaded through their lives, they came to HMV. Then came August 1997, and the single most extraordinary retail moment in the history of the British music industry. Oasis were, at this point, something beyond famous. Their previous album, What's the Story, Morning Glory, had sold over 5 million copies in the UK alone and become the third best-selling album in British chart history. The follow-up, Be Here Now, had been surrounded by an anticipation so intense that the band's management required music journalists who received advance copies to sign legal contracts promising not to discuss the record, even with their partners at home. The secrecy only sharpened the hunger. Be Here Now was released on a Thursday, 21st August 1997. Across the country, fans had queued outside HMV branches from the night before. In some cases from midnight, in others from 4 or 5 in the morning. They stood in the warm late summer dark, strangers alongside strangers, talking or not talking, buying coffee from the nearest corner shop, waiting. When the shutters went up, the queues moved forward. On that first day alone, Be Here Now sold 424,000 copies. In its opening 3 days, it shifted over 663,000 copies, the fastest-selling album in British chart history at the time. Much of that happened in HMV. The BBC's evening news that night showed footage of fans clutching their copies outside HMV branches around the country. Newsreader Trevor McDonald introduced the item with the Oasis phrase, "mad for it," a piece of mid-1990s Manchester slang, now so ubiquitous it required no translation. That a primetime news bulletin was dedicating airtime to album cues said something significant about where music and its retail culture stood in Britain in 1997. They were not peripheral things. They were the news. What did it feel like to work at HMV during those years? One former employee described it simply. There was nowhere else in Britain where you could feel every day that you were at the center of something that genuinely mattered. The music was arriving constantly. New releases every Monday, artists through the door without warning, customers with questions that required real answers. The work was not easy and the pay was not remarkable. But the sense of being present at something important was, for those who cared about music, irreplaceable. The numbers at the close of the decade were extraordinary by any measure. HMV Group was valued at nearly £1 billion on its approach to the London Stock Exchange flotation. The Oxford Street megastore attracted 9 million visitors a year, 320 stores operating across multiple continents, with the 100th UK location opening in 1997 at Fort Dunlop in Birmingham, marked by a performance of Angels by Robbie Williams, the biggest solo star in Britain at that moment. And yet, the culture that had made all of this possible, the culture of physical discovery, of going somewhere to find something you did not know you were looking for, of trusting a person behind a counter with your Saturday afternoon, was already in 1999 beginning to feel the first, barely perceptible tremors of something approaching from a distance. In June 1999, a 19-year-old American college student named Sean Fanning released a piece of software called Napster. It allowed users to share music files with one another for free over the internet. Nobody at HMV's head office in Maidenhead issued a statement. Nobody called an emergency board meeting. Why would they? Napster was a curiosity, a thing for students with fast computers and too much time. The shelves were full. The queues were long. The tills were ringing. What could go wrong? In the summer of 1999, HMV's results looked healthy. The stores were busy. The racks were full. The new Oxford Circus flagship was drawing millions of visitors a year. On paper, nothing was wrong, but the ground was already shifting, and in two different directions at once. The first shift was visible, if inconvenient. Throughout the 1990s, the British supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, had quietly begun selling chart CDs and popular albums at prices no specialist retailer could comfortably match. For the supermarkets, music was never a core business. It was a loss leader, a product sold at or below cost to bring shoppers through the doors, where they would spend their real money on groceries. Tesco did not need to make a profit on the new Robbie Williams album. HMV did. The effect on the high street was gradual but measurable. A customer who had always bought her chart albums at HMV began picking them up with the weekly shop. Not because she preferred Tesco, not because the experience was better, simply because it was cheaper and it was already on the list. HMV could offer expertise, depth, and a curated environment that no supermarket could replicate. What it could not offer was a price match with an organization that regarded music retail as a marketing expense. This was a competition HMV had not chosen and could not win. The response in those early years was essentially to ignore it. HMV's leadership believed, with some justification, that the customers who truly cared about music would keep coming to HMV, and that the casual buyer who would cross the street for a pound off a chart single was not the customer HMV needed to retain. It was a coherent philosophy. It was also, in retrospect, a dangerous one. The casual buyer was more numerous than anyone cared to admit, and once a habit is broken, it rarely returns. The second shift was invisible, and it came from further away. In June 1999, a 19-year-old student at Northeastern University in Boston, named Sean Fanning, launched Napster, a piece of software that allowed users to share music files directly with one another over the internet, free of charge and without restriction. Within 18 months, Napster had amassed 80 million registered users, a number larger than the population of most countries. The music was still being listened to. That was the thing that made Napster so difficult to process. The demand for music had not disappeared. If anything, it was growing. But the demand was no longer converting into the transaction that HMV's entire existence depended upon. People were not going to shops. They were sitting at computers, downloading whatever they wanted, and paying nothing. In HMV's head office and in the wider music industry, the initial response was a combination of outrage and denial. Outrage because the behavior was, legally speaking, theft. Denial because the industry had convinced itself that the experience of physical music, the artwork, the liner notes, the weight of the object in your hand, was irreplaceable, and that people would ultimately return to paying for it. HMV had launched its own online store in 1999, but it was, by most accounts, an afterthought. Lacking integration with the physical stores and without the investment or urgency that the moment demanded. Napster itself was shut down in 2001 following a successful legal action the industry celebrated, and then Kaseya appeared, and LimeWire, and a dozen others. The technology had escaped into the culture, and no court order could retrieve it. Inside HMV on the shop floor, the change was becoming perceptible in a quieter way. The customers who still came were still enthusiastic, often more so than ever, because the people who continued to buy physical music in the early 2000s were increasingly the ones who really cared. But there were fewer of them. The Saturday afternoon crowds were thinning. The casual browser, the person who had wandered in with no specific intention and left with something unexpected, was appearing less often. And it was precisely that kind of customer, the one HMV had been built to serve, who was now spending their Saturday afternoon at a computer rather than at a rack. Did anyone inside HMV notice? Almost certainly. The question is what they did about it. In April 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store. For 99 pence, later 79p in the UK, a customer could buy a single song. Not an album, not a physical object, Not something that required a journey to a shop or a wait for delivery. A song, in seconds, on a device that could hold 1,000 of them. The iPod had launched in 2001, and by 2003, it had already become the defining consumer technology of its generation. A small white object that made the idea of owning a CD player seem almost overnight, unnecessarily complicated. When Apple launched the iTunes Music Store, it became the dominant platform for digital music sales almost overnight. Rather than launching its own competing download store, HMV effectively handed this fast-growing revenue stream to Apple. The belated attempts to sell digital music through in-store kiosks, physical terminals where customers could burn their own CDs from a digital library, never gained any meaningful traction. The kiosks required a trip to the shop. iTunes required nothing except an internet connection. How long could a business built on the physical experience of buying music survive in a world where that experience was no longer necessary? It was a question that HMV's leadership was asking. The internal memos and strategic reviews of the period make that clear. The problem was not a failure of awareness. It was a failure of speed and of structure. HMV was a company built for the high street. Enormous stores, long leases, hundreds of staff, fixed costs locked in years in advance. To pivot meaningfully toward digital would have required not a new strategy, but a new kind of company entirely. And building a new kind of company while running the old one, under pressure from shareholders, with the Waterstones debt still sitting on the balance sheet, was not a problem that admitted of easy solutions. There was one more pressure, less visible than the others, but steadily compounding both. Amazon had been operating in the United Kingdom since 1998. Like the supermarkets, it did not need to make a profit on music in the short term. Its model was built on market share, not margin. Unlike the supermarkets, it offered not just low prices but near infinite selection. Every album, every artist, delivered to your door within days and eventually within hours. The friction of the browsing experience that HMV had always provided, the discovery, the serendipity, the conversation with a staff member, was quietly being replicated online by algorithms that tracked your purchase history and suggested what you might like next. It was a pale imitation of the real thing, but it was available at midnight in your pajamas without the bus fare. By the time HMV's leadership recognized that online retail was a genuine structural threat rather than a passing inconvenience, the key players had already established themselves so firmly that HMV could never realistically break into the dominant group. CNN. The stores were still busy in 2003. The staff were still knowledgeable. The in-store events were still happening. Robbie Williams, Kylie Minogue. New releases every Monday, cues for the big ones. But the cracks were there, for those who looked closely enough. The chart section was getting thinner. The midweek browsing crowds had changed. A small number of long-serving employees, people who had worked in HMV through the Britpop years, through the Oasis queues, through the midnight openings, were beginning to notice something they could not quite name. The shop was the same. The music was the same. But the world outside had quietly become a different place. There is a particular kind of corporate failure that is not caused by ignorance. It is caused by knowing exactly what is happening and being unable to act quickly enough to change it. HMV in the years between 2005 and 2013 was that kind of failure. The people running the company were not fools. They saw the market shifting. They issued profit warnings, commissioned strategic reviews, pursued diversification, bought assets, sold assets, restructured debt. They did, in the language of the boardroom, everything right. And almost none of it worked. To understand why, it is necessary to look not just at the decisions they made, but at the weight they were carrying when they made them. Start with the debt. When HMV Media bought the Waterstones bookshop chain from W.H. Smith in 1998, it paid $300 million. This was not in itself an unreasonable price for a leading British retail brand. The problem was the timing and the structure. The money was borrowed, the interest had to be serviced, and within 4 years of that acquisition, the market for physical media, the foundation on which the entire business rested, had begun its long, irreversible contraction. By 2003, HMV Group was publicly listed on the London Stock Exchange, carrying the full weight of its Waterstones debt, while simultaneously trying to manage the transition from a world where people bought physical music to one where they increasingly did not. The pressure from shareholders for quarterly results was constant. The pressure from lenders was structural. Neither was compatible with the kind of patient long-term investment in digital infrastructure that might have given HMV a competitive platform for the future. The Waterstones business, meanwhile, was developing problems of its own. Its founder, Tim Waterstone, had resigned as chairman in 2001, citing concerns about the direction of the company. His successor had presided over a strategy that the book trade criticized for, in his words, dumbing down selection to chase volume. The brand was losing the literary credibility that had made it valuable. By 2011, HMV sold Waterstones for $53 million, a fraction of what it had paid 13 years earlier. The transaction confirmed what had been clear for some time. HMV had spent $300 million on an asset that, in the conditions it actually faced, was worth far less than it had paid. And who exactly was supposed to protect the people who built this company from decisions made at the top of the organization, in boardrooms they had never entered, about assets they had never used? Then there was FOP. In the summer of 2007, the independent music chain FOP collapsed into administration, closing 81 shops and making 800 people redundant. HMV, to its credit, stepped in quickly and bought the FOP brand, along with 6 stores it judged to be profitable, saving around 70 jobs. The purchase price was modest. The intention was genuine. HMV saw in FOP a complementary identity, a more intimate and curated retail experience that sat alongside the scale of the main brand. What HMV could not change was when this happened. 2007 was the year the iPhone launched. It was the year Netflix began its pivot toward streaming. It was the year digital music sales in the United Kingdom were growing at a rate that made every subsequent investment in physical retail harder to justify. Buying FOP in 2007 was not an act of recklessness. It was an act of faith. Faith that physical music retail still had a future worth investing in. That faith was not unreasonable. What it was in retrospect was one commitment too many, at one moment too late. The diversification strategy that followed deserves to be understood as what it genuinely was: a serious attempt to reinvent the company while still running the old one. In January 2009, HMV invested in a joint venture with Mama Group, acquiring 11 live music venues across the United Kingdom, including the Hammersmith Apollo, one of London's most storied concert halls. The logic was articulated clearly by Chief Executive Simon Fox. Music was in HMV's DNA, and by extending into live performance, the company could offer customers an experience that no digital platform could replicate. You cannot download a concert. You cannot stream the physical experience of standing in a crowd and feeling the bass through the floor. Live music was growing. Physical music was shrinking. The pivot made sense on paper. By December 2009, HMV had paid $46 million for the whole of Mama Group. By May 2012, it had sold the Hammersmith Apollo for $32 million. By December 2012, it had sold the rest of Mama Group for $7.3 million. The entire venture, acquired for tens of millions and intended as a lifeline, had been disposed of inside 4 years at a significant loss, purely to service debt. The live music strategy was not wrong. It was simply too expensive to maintain when the core business was hemorrhaging cash, and every asset on the balance sheet had become a potential sale. In September 2009, HMV bought a 50% stake in 7 Digital, a digital music platform, for $7.7 million. It was the right idea: a digital download service integrated with the HMV brand, giving customers a legitimate online alternative to iTunes. The problem, as analysts had already begun to say, was timing. By the time HMV was focusing seriously on digital, the dominant platforms had already established themselves so firmly that there was no realistic path to breaking in. iTunes had a 6-year head start. The habits of millions of consumers had already formed around platforms that HMV had no part in. The 7 Digital stake was sold as part of the administration in 2013. There is one more force that the company faced, one that was not of its making and not within its power to resolve, but which compounded every other pressure it carried. HMV paid full British business rates on its high street properties. It paid full VAT. It employed thousands of people at full national insurance rates and paid wages into a UK economy it depended upon. These were not choices. They were the ordinary legal obligations of any company doing business in Britain. Amazon, operating from a Luxembourg-based structure, had for years been routing transactions in ways that significantly reduced its UK tax obligations. Even without those structural advantages, Amazon played a fundamentally different game from HMV. It was a company that could operate at a loss for years while building market share, sacrificing short-term profit for long-term dominance. HMV could not do this. HMV had shareholders. It had banks. It had lenders who required repayment on schedules that bore no relation to the timescale of a digital transformation. In 2004, HMV had formally complained to the British Treasury about the competitive distortion created by online retailers routing physical goods through the Channel Islands to exploit a VAT exemption on low-value imports. The complaint was acknowledged. The loophole was eventually closed. In 2012, the year before HMV went into administration for the first time, 8 years had passed. The damage by that point was already done. By 2010, the numbers were telling a story that no strategy document could reverse. Revenue had fallen from $2 billion that year to $1.15 billion in 2011 and to $870 million in 2012. In January 2011, HMV announced it would close 40 stores and issued a profit warning that sent its share price down 20% in a single day. The staff who worked in those stores had known something like this was coming for longer than the headlines suggested. Sales had been falling for years. Midweek footfall had dropped. The ranges had been cut back, the listening stations removed, the in-store events becoming less frequent. The knowledge and enthusiasm that had always defined HMV's floor-level culture was still there, but it was operating in a context that made less and less sense with each passing quarter. In June 2011, Waterstones was sold. In May 2012, the Hammersmith Apollo was sold. In December 2012, the rest of Mama Group was sold. Each disposal was announced as a strategic focus on the core business. Each one was, in reality, a company selling parts of itself to stay alive. The core business itself, the thing HMV had always been, the thing it had been building since 1921, was a shop, a very good shop. In some ways, still the best shop of its kind in Britain, but a shop whose entire reason for existing depended on people wanting to buy physical music and entertainment in a physical space, at a price that reflected the real cost of running that space. In 2012, digital music downloads overtook physical music sales in the United Kingdom for the first time in history. The tipping point had come. It had taken longer than many predicted, and the end, when it arrived, came faster than almost anyone was prepared for. The first time HMV died, it happened on a Tuesday, the 15th of January, 2013. A Tuesday morning in January, the bleakest month of the British retail calendar, 2 weeks after Christmas, when the tills have gone quiet and the returns pile up, and every company discovers whether it has survived the season it depended upon. HMV had not. At 9 o'clock that morning, HMV Group appointed Deloitte as administrators, suspended its shares on the London Stock Exchange, and placed the livelihoods of 4,150 employees across 236 stores into the hands of an accountancy firm. The announcement was reported on the BBC's Morning News. The share price, suspended rather than traded, ceased to exist as a number. The gift vouchers that tens of thousands of customers had received as Christmas presents 2 weeks earlier were declared void. Worthless paper, because the people holding them were classified in law as unsecured creditors, last in line behind the banks. The gift voucher decision provoked immediate public fury. People who had been given HMV vouchers by their children on Christmas Day, by partners who knew what they loved, by well-meaning relatives who had done the sensible thing and bought something they could choose for themselves. All of them were turned away at the till. Members of Parliament began using the word theft. The accusation was not legally precise, but it captured the feeling accurately enough. Within a week, HMV reversed the decision and began accepting vouchers again. The reversal said less about goodwill than about the scale of the outcry. Then came the tweet that defined everything. On the 31st of January 2013, Deloitte confirmed that 190 members of staff were being made redundant across HMV's head office and distribution network. At the same moment, in the offices in Maidenhead, where those redundancies were being processed, something happened that no public relations professional in Britain could have scripted. A 21-year-old social media coordinator named Poppy Rose Clear had been handed her notice along with more than 60 colleagues in a single group meeting. Before she left the building, she still had access to HMV's official Twitter account. She used it. The tweets that followed read, "We're tweeting live from HR where we're all being fired. Exciting. Just HMV factor firing, and there are over 60 of us being fired at once. Mass execution of loyal employees who love the brand." Then a few minutes later, the tweet that made headlines around the world. "Just overheard our marketing director. He's staying, folks. Ask, how do I shut down Twitter?" The tweets went viral within minutes, shared thousands of times across the world in under an hour. By the following morning, every major newspaper in Britain and many across the Atlantic had run the story. The image of a company so disconnected from the platform it supposedly operated on that its marketing director did not know how to access his own social media account. In the same moment that the people who actually understood those platforms were being escorted from the building, was devastating in its symbolism. Poppy Rose later explained herself plainly. She had no mortgage, no dependents. She had felt, in the chaos of that morning, that someone needed to speak. She had wanted, she said, to show those who refused to be educated the power of social media. She was 21 years old. She had worked at HMV for 2 years. She loved the brand, and the brand in its final hours of corporate existence had fired her in a group of 60 people without individual acknowledgement or ceremony. Those who ruined the business, she had written in her last tweet from the account, are safe. Hooray. The store closures came in waves. First 66 shops identified as loss-making, then a further 37. Town by town, the signs in the windows changed. Blue Cross sale stickers replaced by the blunt language of administration. Clearance. Final days. Everything must go. For the staff who worked in those stores, the days between the announcement and the closure were a particular kind of difficult. Customers came in with the complex mixture of grief and appetite that attends any closing down sale, wanting to express something about what the place had meant to them and also wanting the discounts. The employees stood at their posts and processed the transactions and answered the questions and kept the shelves faced. Some of them had worked in the same store for 15 years. Some had started their first job there. The redundancy notices gave them the legal minimum of notice. The law does not require more than that. On the 5th of April 2013, Hilco UK, a restructuring specialist which had already acquired HMV Canada, announced that it had purchased the business from administrators, saving 141 stores and approximately 2,500 jobs. It had bought HMV's debt from the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyd's Banking Group for around $110 million. Now it owned HMV itself for an estimated $50 million more. The total debt at the time of administration had stood at approximately $176 million. Hilco had acquired a century-old British institution for the price of a mid-sized commercial property in central London. The rescue was genuine as far as it went. Stores stayed open. Jobs were saved, though the workforce was halved from its pre-administration peak. The Oxford Circus megastore, the one that had held the Guinness record, that Bob Geldof had opened, that 9 million people a year had walked through, closed permanently in January 2014 and was eventually converted into a Sports Direct. In its place, HMV moved back to its original address, 363 Oxford Street, the building where Edward Elgar had stood in 1921, where the Beatles had changed the world in 1962. The return felt less like a homecoming than a retreat. 5 years of relative stability followed. Hilco ran HMV with the efficiency of a company that understood retail restructuring. The stores were leaner, the range was tighter, the staff numbers were lower, DVD sales continued to fall, and in the Christmas trading period of 2018, the market for DVD collapsed by over 30% compared to the previous year. On the 28th of December 2018, 3 days after Christmas, HMV entered administration for the second time. Paul McGowan, executive chairman of HMV and Hilco, did not dress it up. The deterioration in the DVD market had been unsustainable, he said, and HMV had faced a tsunami of challenges. The word tsunami had become something of a refrain in British retail by this point, used to describe the wave of digital disruption, rising business rates, and online competition that had reshaped every high street in the country. The word was accurate. What it did not capture was the particular cruelty of the timing. Fist.org. 3 days after Christmas, 2,200 people, most of them in shops, most of them on seasonal contracts that had just been extended for the holiday period. The timing of an administration filing is a legal decision, not a moral one. That does not change what it felt like to the people it affected. This time, the administrator was KPMG. This time, gift vouchers were honored from the outset. The lesson of 2013 had been absorbed, and this time a buyer emerged more quickly. On the 5th of February 2019, just over 5 weeks after the second administration was announced, a Canadian company called Sunrise Records acquired HMV Retail Ltd. for an amount later confirmed by the Financial Times to be $883,000. £883,000 for the name, for the stores, for the Nipper logo, for 100 years of history. The number is not a misprint. Of HMV's 127 remaining stores, 100 were retained. The other 27 were closed immediately. Among them, the flagship at 363 Oxford Street, the building where it had all begun. The store that had opened with Edward Elgar in 1921, that had pressed the Beatles demo tape in 1962, that had been the beating heart of British music culture for a century, closed its doors on the 5th of February 2019 without ceremony. No announcement. No event. The shutters came down and the street moved on. What does it mean when a place where people have brought their grief and their joy and their Saturday afternoons for 100 years closes without anyone to mark it? That question was not answered by the administrators. It was not answered by the balance sheet. It was left, as such questions usually are, to the people who had been there, who remembered, who kept the memory alive in the particular way that only those who were present can. The building at 363 Oxford Street did not stay empty for long. Within months of HMV's departure in February 2019, the premises were occupied by a series of American candy outlets. The brightly lit sugar shops that had been proliferating across London's tourist streets in the years since the pandemic, filling the gaps left by the retailers that had gone before them. The building where Edward Elgar had opened the first HMV shop in 1921, where Brian Epstein had walked in with a reel-to-reel tape in 1962, where the Saturday crowds had gathered for nearly a century, was now selling imported American sweets to tourists who did not know and could not have been expected to know what had stood there before. It was in its way a precise image of what the British High Street had become. The rest of the story of the companies that outlasted HMV, that inherited its customers and its market, is not a story of triumph. Our price had been gone since 2004. Virgin Megastore had rebranded as Zavvi in 2007 and collapsed into administration a year later. Tower Records had closed its last UK stores in 2009. HMV had outlasted all of them. It had been the last specialist music retailer standing in Britain. When it fell, there was nothing of comparable scale to replace it. The customers did not disappear. Demand for music did not disappear. What disappeared was the physical place where the two had met. The shared space where a stranger might hand you something and say, "Try this." The internet offered recommendation algorithms. Streaming platforms offered curated playlists. Neither offered the thing that HMV had provided for 100 years. The accidental discovery, the human conversation, the sense of belonging to a community that gathered in a specific place because they cared about the same things. What do we lose when a gathering place disappears and nothing takes its place? The answer, in the years that followed, came from an unexpected direction. The vinyl revival had begun quietly in the mid-2000s, driven initially by independent record shops and serious collectors who had never abandoned the format. By 2022, it had become something considerably larger. Vinyl outsold CDs in the United Kingdom for the first time since 1987, generating $150.5 million in sales. British consumers bought 5.5 million records that year, the largest volume since 1990. A format that the industry had declared dead in the early 1990s was outselling the digital disc that had supposedly killed it. This was the lifeline that Doug Putman had bet on when Sunrise Records acquired HMV for $883,000 in February 2019. Putman was a Canadian entrepreneur with a reputation for rescuing physical retail brands that others had written off. He had already turned around HMV's Canadian operations after they entered receivership in 2017. He understood something that HMV's previous owners had been slow to grasp. The customers who still came to physical music shops were not the ones who needed persuading. They were the ones who had already decided. They were enthusiasts, collectors, people for whom the act of ownership, the weight of the record, the sleeve art, the ritual of putting the needle down, was part of what music meant to them. Serving that customer required a different kind of shop from the one that had been trying to compete with streaming on streaming's own terms. Under Putman, HMV stopped trying to be everything. The Birmingham outlet, the HMV Vault, opened in October 2019 and the largest entertainment store in Europe, sells 25,000 vinyl albums alongside 80,000 CDs and 40,000 DVDs. The in-store events returned. Stormzy, Ed Sheeran, Charlie XCX, Shania Twain. The live and local program supported grassroots musicians, hosting around 2,500 in-store gigs across the estate in 2023 alone. The business posted gross profits of $65.4 million for 2022 on revenue that had grown by nearly 67%. By 2023, it was expanding again into Ireland, into Belgium, with further European markets under consideration. And then, in November 2023, HMV returned to 363 Oxford Street, the original address, the building where it had all begun. The premises that had been occupied by an American candy shop were stripped back and refitted. The new format store opened with the new HMV logo and a layout built around vinyl, pop culture merchandise, live music, and the particular energy that the best version of HMV had always generated. People gathered in a physical space because they loved something. Doug Putman called the reopening the culmination of several years of hard work. It was also something else, an acknowledgement that the story was not, after all, entirely over. The lesson that the collapse and partial resurrection of HMV teaches the broader industry is not a comfortable one, because it is not really about retail at all. Every major specialist music retailer in the English-speaking world, Tower Records, Sam Goody, Virgin Megastore, Our Price, Zavvi, was destroyed by the same forces that nearly destroyed HMV. The shift from physical to digital was not unique to Britain. The Amazon effect was not unique to music. The failure of physical retail to compete on price with platforms that did not need to make a profit on any individual transaction was a structural fact, not a management failure. What was specific to HMV was the weight of the Waterstones acquisition, the size of the stores, the cost of the leases, and the particular cruelty of the timing. Arriving at the moment of peak physical media sales and being locked into that structure precisely as the market began its contraction. A different set of decisions at different moments might have produced a different outcome, or it might not have. The forces at work were large enough that no management team, however talented, could be certain of navigating them. What can be said with confidence is this: the companies and individuals who came through the wreckage, the independent record shops that never expanded beyond what they could sustain, the vinyl enthusiasts who kept buying when the format was unfashionable, the new HMV under Putman that asked itself honestly what it was for, rather than trying to be everything to everyone, survived by understanding something that the old HMV had known in its bones, but found it impossible to act on in its final years. The point was never the product. The point was always the experience of being in the room with other people who cared about the same thing. The product is digital now. The room, for those willing to maintain it, still matters. It is a Saturday afternoon. The year could be 1975 or 1987 or 1995. It does not matter which. You push through the door and the sound hits you first. Not music exactly, but the particular ambience of a room where music is always playing, where the bass notes travel through the floor and the high notes get lost somewhere in the racks above your head. The smell is specific, plastic sleeve and printed cardboard, and something faintly electrical, warm from the lights. The aisles stretch ahead of you in rows, alphabetical and intimate, and you move into them the way you move into a library, with the particular quiet alertness of someone who is looking for something they cannot yet name. Your hand runs along the spines. You pull one forward, read the back, slide it in again. You pull out another. You have been in this aisle before, in this shop, on dozens of Saturdays before this one. The person behind the counter glances up. You have seen each other enough times that you nod. Nothing more is needed. This is a place where you belong, even if no one ever said so. You have never signed anything or paid a membership fee. The belonging is simply a fact, demonstrated every week by the fact that you are here again. You find something you were not looking for. You hold it for a moment. Then you carry it to the counter. What HMV was at its best was a place that took seriously the idea that music deserves to be chosen. Not shuffled into your ear by an algorithm that has predicted your preferences. Not delivered to a device in seconds without friction or ceremony. Chosen, held in the hand, considered, carried home. The distinction matters more than it sounds. The act of choosing something, of spending time with it before you own it, of hearing a recommendation from a person who cared enough to make one, these are not inefficiencies to be designed away. They are part of how music enters a life. They are part of how it stays. For a generation of British people, HMV was the infrastructure of that process. It was where you went when you knew what you wanted and where you went when you did not. It was where the arguments happened, the ones that began at the listing station and continued on the bus home and never quite resolved. It was where the first job was, for thousands of people who would spend the rest of their working lives in music or adjacent to it, who traced the thing they became back to the years behind that counter. It was where the father stood with the child and pointed at something and said, "This one changed everything for me," and the child took it home and understood years later what had been meant. The high street without it became measurably quieter. Not in volume, the cities are louder than ever, but in a quality of attention, in the presence of people gathered in a place because they chose to be, rather than because they had to be. Shops that exist to serve a genuine enthusiasm, rather than to fulfill a necessity, create a different kind of public space. They make the street more human. When they close, something contracts. It cannot be easily named and it cannot be easily replaced, which is why the closing of HMV branches across Britain was mourned in a way that the closing of a supermarket or a bank branch almost never is. People understood, without having to articulate it, that what they were losing was a gathering place that had taken a particular form of care to build. Whether the music streaming services, the algorithms, the recommendation engines that have replaced the Saturday afternoon in the racks, whether these things are better or worse is a question that does not have a clean answer. They deliver music to more people in more places than HMV ever could. They are cheaper, they are faster, they are available at 3 in the morning and on the other side of the world. They have given listeners access to a scale of recorded human expression that would have seemed impossible to any customer who walked into 363 Oxford Street in 1975. These are not small things, but they do not put you in a room with anyone. They do not produce the encounter with another person's knowledge that changes what you think you like. They do not create the Friday night queue in the cold outside the shutters, the strangers standing close together in the dark, because they all want the same thing at the same time. That particular form of belonging, accidental, unplanned, constituted by nothing more than shared enthusiasm in a shared space, has no digital equivalent. It probably never will. HMV was born in the same year that the British Broadcasting Corporation began its first radio transmissions. It outlasted the cassette tape and the 8-track and the mini disc and the CD. It survived the invention of the internet, the arrival of Amazon, the launch of Napster and iTunes and Spotify. It survived in diminished form 2 administrations and a global pandemic. On Oxford Street in November 2023, It opened its doors again in the building where it all began. Smaller now, leaner, different in character, but present. Nipper still stands above the sign, ears up, head tilted, still listening for the voice that speaks to him from the machine, still puzzling over where it comes from, still trusting that it means something even if he cannot say what. Francis Barreau painted that image in 1898 because he observed something true about the relationship between a creature and the sound it loves. The creature does not understand the mechanism. It does not need to. What it knows is that the voice is real, that it has heard it before, that it matters in ways beyond explaining. That is what music is. That is what HMV was for 100 years, for anyone who walked through its doors and heard something they had not heard before. The dog is still listening.